Hi, my name is Alex Greco, and this is for my author discussion of Malcolm X. Malcolm X was originally born Malcolm Little in 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska. His parents were Louise and Earl Little. His father was a Baptist preacher who was a follower of the nationalist doctrines of Marcus Garvey. And because of this, he, when Malcolm was little, the Ku Klux Klan had visited his house, and when uh, believe that his mother was pregnant with Malcolm at the time, but the Ku Klux Klan had visited his house and they were looking for him because he was a follower of Marcus Garvey and they didn't want him spreading that nonsense around to all the other black people around town. So they had moved, but when they moved, um, he was actually killed, and it was claimed that he had committed suicide when it was clearly a murder. He was basically decapitated. Um, and because they uh, claimed that it was a suicide, and it was very clear it wasn't, that way his family was denied the death benefits that they were owed, and and then later in life, Malcolm, a little later in his childhood, uh, Malcolm was placed in a foster home at the age of 6 after his mother had a nervous breakdown. Malcolm headed for Boston after middle school, and then to New York, leading a life of crime, where he was known as Detroit Red, and he had straightened his hair to try to uh, personify the white man. And when he was 21, he was sentenced to prison for 6 years in 1946 for a burglary in Massachusetts. It was in prison where he was converted to the Nation of Islam because of his encounter with the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, who was the leader of the Nation of Islam at the time. Um, he adopted the last name X to symbolize Little as a slave name. After his release from prison, he became a minister at the Temple Number 7. Um, he was often compared at the Temple Number 7, and he was often compared to Martin Luther King Jr. However, he was more radical. As his popularity gained, he became a threat to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, who he was at odds with at the time because the Nation of Islam would not join the civil rights movement. He was suspended from the Nation of Islam in 1963 for comments made on President John F. Kennedy's assassination. He left the organization when he traveled to Mecca and discovered the Orthodox Muslims and how they preach equality to all. When he returned to America, he returned as El Hajj Malik El Shabazz. He still thought only blacks could free themselves from the racism in America, which he mentioned in some of his speeches. And I will later talk about his speech, The Ballad of the Bullet, which I think kind of relates to this. In 1964, he founded the Organization of the Afro-American Unity and moved towards socialism. On February 21st, this is a picture of him when he was in Mecca. On February 21st, 1965, he was assassinated at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem, which was said to be orchestrated by the black Muslims of the Nation of Islam. The autobiography of Malcolm X borrows a variety of narrative forms, from spiritual to even more cheerful. The reader must remain alert and adjust. You should adjust your expectation and evaluation of what you're reading. Right away in the reading, you know that Malcolm X is the narrator and that nobody else could be telling his story the way it is written, except for him. On page 569 of the Gates and Smith book, chapter 4 of the autobiography, Malcolm says, quote, "I was up in the jostling crowd and suddenly, unexpectedly, I got the idea. It was as though somebody had clicked on the light. My long suppressed African instincts broke through and loose." End quote. This is just one of the many quotes I could have used to describe how you feel reading this. It feels as if Malcolm is talking to you. That's how much in first person it is, hence the autobiography. And however, this autobiography is also co-written by African American journalist Alex Haley. I think it is very purposeful, however, how first person they made it, because it is like it is as if Malcolm is talking to Alex Haley, and obviously they're writing it together, but they really made it seem like Malcolm is really like just talking to you while you're reading it, which I thought was done on purpose, and I thought it was brilliant. Um, it is about his life from his early childhood to being a criminal to being saved by Allah and finally his demise. He was painfully honest and even foreshadowed his death in his writing. The chapter titled 1965, which is chapter 19, the last chapter, is pretty much implying what is going to happen to him in his life. It isn't necessarily written down that he died because but he just predicted it. So he predicted his own death, basically, and that is what you're supposed to get from this last chapter, is that he predicted his own death. Malcolm X was very fiery and well-spoken in a lot of his speeches as well, and he was a very well-spoken man who knew how to use his words to his advantage. Often, he takes an example from his life on the streets and translate it into an example of racial oppression of African Americans. He uses a lot of similes and metaphors to do so, which I think is genius. And an example of this that I found was when he says in chapter 6, quote, "Many times since I have thought about it and what it really meant. In one sense, we were huddled in there, bonded together and seeking security and warmth and comfort from each other. And we didn't know it. All of us who might have probed space or cured cancer or built industries were instead black victims of the white man's American social system. In another sense, the tragedy of once master pickpocket made him, for those brother old time hustlers, there but for the grace of God symbol, to wolves who were still able to catch some rabbits, it had meaning that an old wolf who had lost his fangs was still eating." And this can be found on page 573 of the Gates and Smith book, but taken from the autobiography of Malcolm X. And I just think that he uses like the metaphors about to wolves who were still able to catch some rabbits. It had meaning that an old wolf who had lost his fangs was still eating. He gets that from what he says earlier in the quote, and how he goes from who might have probed space or cured cancer or built industries were instead black victims, and he made it about social injustice, which I really liked, and I thought he does that a lot, and I like how he does that. And then as far as themes go, I think that self-transformation is an important theme in the autobiography of Malcolm X, and just transformation in general. Malcolm X changes so much throughout that it would seem that he has like multiple personalities. He has more than one personality throughout his whole life. And however, besides himself, I think there's a lot of changing going on in general from when he was first born to what was going on. And he even reminisced on how he has a little white in him because his mother's father, he was like, I still hate the rapist white man that is in me because that is who her father was. So, from that time to where he was with the civil rights movement, and he became a very prominent figure in the civil rights movement, that is just transformation of society, and obviously how much further we have come today. But during that time, how much society has transformed and changed throughout the time of his life, I thought was a big theme. And I also think another theme is like language and how important communication is, because he is like the main symbol of how one could really make words powerful and really strike a chord with people. And his words alone have accomplished so much. So I think that is a very important theme. And lastly, what I'd like to talk about is one of his most famous speeches, the Ballad or the Bullet speech. And I just took a quote from this speech, and I think it ties into what I was saying earlier with how he thought that only blacks could free themselves from racism in America. And this is when he was really like the way if you hear the speech, you could hear it in his voice how how meaningful it is and how powerful it is. And he says, "Why does it look like," he says, quote, "Why does it look like it might be the year of the ballot or the bullet? Because Negroes have listened to the trickery and the lies and the false promise of the white man now for too long, and they're fed up. They've become disenchanted. They become disillusioned. They become dissatisfied. And all of this has built up frustrations in the black community that makes the black community throughout America today more explosive than all of the atomic bombs the Russians can ever invent. Whenever you got a racial powder keg sitting in your lap, you're in more trouble than if you had an atomic powder keg sitting in your lap. When a racial powder keg goes off, it doesn't care who knocks it out the way. Understand this, it's dangerous." And I think that's what he was trying to get the point across, is um that the black people together, coming together and fighting against just racism is more powerful than anything, and it's very dangerous, and obviously it worked. um so yeah, that is my author discussion on Malcolm X. Thank you.